Evelyn Zumaya rates AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 274, chapter 14, titled, Warning, Read This, You Could Be Sent to Prison. 16 years later. By 1941, Joe Schenck was wearing prison stripes and cracking rocks in the yard of a federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. The once powerful Hollywood mogul was serving a 5-year sentence on a conviction of 3 counts of tax evasion and 1 count of committing perjury to a grand jury. Joe Schenck landed behind bars after a federal investigation revealed he pocketed millions of dollars from a lucrative arrangement with the Hollywood mob. Prior to his conviction, Joe Schenck and Chicago crime boss Frank Nitti's Hollywood frontman Willie Bioff engaged in a profitable partnership for several years. After Nitti sent Bioff to Hollywood, Bioff assumed control over the 125,000-member Union of the International Alliance of Theater Stage Employees. Recognizing Bioff as a valuable ally, Joe Schenck began contributing to his crooked operation. Schenck's regular payoffs assured there would be no interference from the powerful union, while he hired and fired at will, and forced his studio employees to work long overtime hours during the height of the Depression for no extra compensation. Schenck made his payments to Willie Bioff by passing cash wrapped in brown paper packages through a series of middlemen. While Schenck saved millions by cheating union workers out of their hard-earned overtime pay, Willie Bioff enjoyed a 10-carat lifestyle. The gig was up when Schenck mistakenly made one of his payments to Bioff in the form of a personal check. As Schenck's $100,000 check changed hands, someone put the 2 and 2 together. The check was forwarded to the Screen Actors Guild's president, actor Robert Montgomery, and he wasted no time telephoning the Internal Revenue Service. After a thorough scouring of Schenck's books, the feds handed down an indictment. Facing what promised to be a lengthy prison sentence, Schenck cut a deal with the federal government and divulged every detail of the scam as he sang his heart out to a grand jury. As a result of Schenck's testimony, every studio head in Hollywood was subpoenaed to testify in the unfolding scandal. When the dust settled, the most notorious Chicago and Hollywood mob bosses, as well as Joe Schenck, were all sent off to prison. Only Frank Nitti evaded a lengthy stint in jail by putting a loaded gun to his head and blowing his brains out. While Schenck served his hard time in a federal penitentiary, out in Hollywood, his old nemesis George Ullman was facing his own brush with the law, the L.A. County Sheriff. Nearly 2 decades after Rudy's death, a 27-year-old Gene Valentino was still trying to collect on the judgment he held against George. Gene diligently ensured his collection orders never expired by instructing his attorneys to regularly file the necessary paperwork with the court and the L.A. County Sheriff's Office. By Christmas time of 1941, Gene's collection orders were once again in place, and the amount George owed plus interest totaled just over $100,000. Gene steadfastly ignored the California Appeals Court's recommendation that the entire judgment against George be dismissed in light of the unusual disappearance and discovery of paragraph 4th. Bound and determined to collect the entire amount due, he instructed his attorneys to have at Mr. Ullman by offering them a percentage of any money they were able to collect. Gene's legal actions resulted in years of uninterrupted property seizure and wage garnishment orders being filed against George. These court orders, declaring all of George's assets and his talent agency's profits subject to Gene's confiscation, were served on George at his agency and at his home by deputies from the L.A. County Sheriff's Office. 16 years after Rudy's death, George was far from being a wealthy man and earning a modest income as a talent agent. The probability that Gene would ever reap his handsome windfall was slim to none. Gene remained undeterred, and by 1941, he was not only intently focused upon the enforcement of his collection orders, but also upon the compilation of a list of items he believed George had removed without permission from Falcon Lair many, many years ago. His lengthy list, however, did not include those items that George, as executor, permitted Alberto Valentino and Maria Strada to remove from Falcon Lair after Rudy's death. These items included, among other things, Rudy's platinum wristwatch, a pair of platinum cufflinks, a white gold cigarette case, emerald and sapphire rings, and an automobile. Whether Gene was aware of the technical loophole or not, a portion of the judgment he was seeking to collect from George included the cash value for these very items George once dispersed as, quote, unauthorized property advances. Nevertheless, Gene kept this list of items close at hand and devoted himself to the reclamation of each and every one. With Gene's property seizure and wage garnishment orders again under full enforcement by the end of 1941, George's economic survival depended upon the vigilant defense of his personal property and agency. He incorporated his business, maintained meticulous accounting ledgers, and extensive inventories of his property, while recording every household and business transaction. He was ordered by the court to regularly submit these ledgers to Gene's attorney for review, and he complied upon every occasion. Completely unaware of Gene's list of missing items, George stored his remaining keepsakes from his days as Rudy's manager in 2 large, unremarkable wicker hampers in his garage. He paid little attention to the contents of the crates, other than an occasional Sunday afternoon's sentimental perusal. Under intense scrutiny from Gene's attorneys and the L.A. County Sheriff's Office, George worked every day in his Sunset Boulevard office and supported his family by securing work for the actors he represented, including John Carradine, Frank Orth, and Francis Lederer. The Allman boys were by then teenagers and contributed to the family's income by working part-time jobs after school. And as soon as daughter Bunny could type, she went to work in her father's office. On December 11th, 1942, George made his first payment to Gene Valentino of just less than $6,000. He received the funds for this payment from the final settlement of the $100,000 insurance bond he posted in October of 1926 as a guarantee of his performance as executor. The issuer of that bond, the Indemnity Insurance Company, would have paid the entire judgment held against George had the company not gone bankrupt during the first years of the Depression. Gene deposited George's check from the defunct Indemnity Insurance Company and then promptly renewed all of his collection orders on the remainder of the judgment. By some uncharitable twist of fate, Gene's reinstatement of the collection orders cycled a few days before Christmas. This generated considerable Yuletide bitterness in the Allman household towards both Alberto and Gene Valentino. As George's steep legal fees continued to accrue, Gene's holiday collection orders eventually exacted their financial toll. In February of 1943, George filed a voluntary bankruptcy petition. When he filed for bankruptcy, the court assessed his personal liabilities at $106,000 and reported that he held 0 assets other than his personal insurance policies and household goods, which were itemized in a lengthy inventory and declared exempt from Gene's seizure. Meanwhile, George's wicker hampers of souvenirs from his life with Rudy sat in the corner of his garage, neglected, shrouded in cobwebs, and gathering dust. The crates contained a hodgepodge collection of miscellaneous artifacts, including a few bundles of molding documents, envelopes crammed with photographs and letters, Rudy's several address books, and other musty mementos. In 1943, the contents of these wicker hampers were of such material insignificance they did not merit the slightest mention in the extensive inventory conducted by the court at the time of George's bankruptcy petition. But this was all about to change. as George's hampers were on the verge of becoming hot property. A stranger had just arrived in Los Angeles who was about to inflate the value of those dusty containers to crown jewel status. One slow afternoon at the S. George Ullman Agency, George looked up from his work to see a lanky young man standing before him. He introduced himself as William Self and informed George he was seeking work as an actor. George motioned for him to take a seat and began asking a few stock questions. When the young man said he had no experience in front of a camera, George replied he couldn't do a thing for him. Any other aspiring actor might have been thwarted by the agent's rejection, but William Self had more than a passing interest in the man behind the desk at the S. George Ullman Agency that day. He knew George Ullman was once Rudolph Valentino's business manager and closest friend, and when it came to the subject of Rudolph Valentino, William Self was nothing if not zealous. After arriving in Los Angeles from his hometown in Ohio, Self quickly and quietly tracked down any of Rudolph Valentino's friends, family members, lovers, and wives who might still be living in Hollywood. So when George Ullman sent Self on his way, the actor was hardly dismayed. He soon began stopping by the S. George Ullman Agency on Sunset Boulevard for some friendly small talk with George about his old pal Rudolph Valentino. William Self would secure work in only a string of minor screen roles. But in his role as soft-spoken, affable, Midwestern good guy, he could have taken an Oscar home year after year. He handily charmed his way to the top in record time and found ample opportunity to hobnob with Valentino's peers of the silent movie era. He hit the golf courses and tennis courts and attended celebrity funerals just, quote, to see who might show up. Before long, he was being invited to the Ullman home and including Rudolph Valentino's manager on his growing list of new best friends. Rudy's old guard believed they'd found a sincere friend in William Self, Alberto and Jean Valentino, Rudy's first wife Jean Acker, Rudy's friends Paul Ivanhoe and Robert Flory, and George and B. Ullman all held complete faith in Self's genuine interest in Rudy and supported him wholeheartedly when he began collecting Valentino memorabilia. Only Pola Negri refused Self's overtures by bristling that, quote, he only wanted to talk to her about Rudy. The one missing trophy in Self's collection of Valentino friends was Natasha Rambova. He grew frustrated with his inability to connect with the elusive Rambova, as she had yet to return to the West Coast. In case he did meet her, Self petitioned the aging Paul Ivanhoe for a letter of introduction which might convince Rambova that he was a, quote, good guy. Ivanhoe obliged, and Self carried this letter with him at all times. William Self was acutely aware that when it came to befriending Alberto and Jean Valentino and George Ullman, he walked a fine line. Consequently, Self maintained a precarious balance between the three men. Jean's continued efforts to collect the $100,000 judgment from George complicated Self's efforts to become friendly with the warring parties. As Self would soon learn, he had his work cut out for him, as Jean was relentless in his pursuit of the $100,000. In November of 1947, he petitioned a court to revoke the S. George Ullman Agency's status as a corporation and requested a complete court audit of the agency's records. Jean informed the court he believed the S. George Ullman Agency's profits, quote, truly belonged to him. If the court ruled in Jean's favor, he could seize George's agency and its assets. The court complied and subpoenaed all of George's business records, including his payroll accounts, bank statements, canceled checks, and all contracts with the artists he represented. As the Christmas lights were being untangled and strung up one more time that year, George was again being served with a series of legal documents by the L.A. County Sheriff. His desk was buried under another incoming wave of notices of wage garnishment, summons to appear in court, subpoenas for documents, notices of complaints on the judgment, and stipulations on the judgment. When Jean Valentino made his Christmas 1947 raid on George's agency, the total of the judgment, including interest, had increased to nearly $120,000. As George gathered the subpoenaed records, he realized that in doing so, many of his clients' confidential contracts were about to become public record. After spending an afternoon sorting through his office files, he arrived home lugging a few heavy cardboard boxes full of paperwork. While his family wondered what he was doing, George chucked the cartons in his backyard and began tossing fistfuls of the paper into a rusty incinerator can. With the strike of a match, he sent it all up in flames. The court would rule against Jean Valentino, and for the time being, the S. George Ullman Agency was safe from seizure. In an effort to trim his business expenses during those leanest of years, George leased half of his Sunset Boulevard office to a fellow talent agent. Only a few days after this agent assumed occupancy of the space, George discovered that Rudy and Natasha's letters, kept in his desk drawer, had been replaced with some shoddy forgeries. George eyed his new co-worker as the perpetrator of the switcheroo and showed him the door. For over 20 years, George had paid little attention to his Valentino mementos, but he suddenly realized they were accruing in value. With this in mind, he headed for his garage to take a closer look at the contents of those wicker hampers. He knew that if this property did indeed have any monetary value, Jean Valentino could seize and liquidate the lot into cash. Adamant Rudy's archives deserved safer guardianship, George began giving gifts of his Valentino artifacts to his friend and avid collector, William Self. It was then George and Self initiated an annual tradition that would continue for many years. Every year on Self's birthday, June 21st, George arrived at Self's home to present him with another Valentino treasure for his collection. Over the years, Self changed the direction of his Hollywood career from bit actor to successful television producer, and George believed his interest in owning Rudy's possessions went well beyond any cash value. George had no idea that Jean Valentino regularly shared his missing items list with Self, or that Jean claimed legal ownership of every snippet of Rudolph Valentino, whether it had been in George's personal possession for decades or not. George also had no idea William Self was forging a solid friendship with both Jean and Alberto Valentino, or that they were also handing him tidbits of Rudy. It was only a matter of time before Jean spotted a few of the items on his list being proudly displayed in Self's burgeoning collection. When he confronted Self about the situation, Self informed Jean that these items were given to him as birthday gifts from George Ullman. He would keep them for the time being. Self appeased Jean's ire by agreeing to bequeath the items to him when he, quote, kicked the bucket. One of these disputed items was George's birthday gift of the last photo ever taken of Rudy, which he inscribed to Pola Negri. Self's private Rudy reserve continued to grow, and he deftly assumed ownership of a cache of archives, including letters Rudy wrote, pleading with his first wife, Jean Acker, to be his wife in every sense of the word, Rudy's original United Artists contract, the files of Rudy's attorney, W.I. Gilbert, and Rudy's personal copy of The Sheik, inscribed to him by the book's author, E.M. Hall. George remained confident he was safeguarding Rudy's treasures, and during increasingly dark financial times, he continued to deliver his remaining Valentino mementos to Self as birthday gifts. Collector Self was elated with each fresh acquisition, and George believed his friendship with Self grew stronger and Rudy's earthly legacy secured. But even though George had worked with actors his entire life, when it came to William Self, he failed to recognize a stellar performance. On April 15th, 1952, Her Majesty Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and His Royal Highness Prince Bernhard arrived in Los Angeles for a state visit. A parade was organized for the royal couple, and they rode down Broadway to City Hall in an open touring car, waving to the cheering crowds lining the streets. After a visit with the mayor of Los Angeles, Queen Juliana and Prince Bernard were given a grand tour of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's studios by the studio chief, Louis B. Mayer. Later that afternoon, the Queen and her prince returned by motorcade to the Beverly Hills Hotel on Sunset Boulevard. Every newspaper in Los Angeles published the royal couple's itinerary days in advance of their arrival, and this guaranteed crowds of Los Angelinos following their every move. By 4:15, as Queen Juliana's motorcade inched its way down Sunset Boulevard towards the Beverly Hills Hotel, the crowds of onlookers brought traffic to a standstill. In an effort to get the traffic moving again on the busy thoroughfare, the Beverly Hills Police Department dispatched a few more officers to the scene. These reserve police officers rushed to the line of duty, waving their arms and blowing their whistles. Few people in the crowd that afternoon probably recognized two of these uniformed Beverly Hills police officers as Rudolph Valentino's manager, George Ullman, and his son, Bob. George and Bob usually worked the night shift downtown in the city's business district, but on that afternoon they were called into emergency service as traffic cops. The streets were a lot tamer back in 1923 when Officer George Ullman first arrived in Los Angeles. In those days, signs were posted on the back of the city's streetcars warning, "Don't shoot rabbits from the rear of the platform." And Hollywood's only traffic cop worked the corner of Hollywood and Vine. But on April 15th, 1952, on the very Sunset Boulevard where he once rushed between his luxurious home on Foothill Drive and Rudy's Falcon Lair on Bella Drive, Officer Ullman waved to the stalled traffic and yelled a perfunctory, "Move it along." On December 2nd of that same year, one headline simply read, "From bad to worse." And apparently the reporter filing the article grasped the gist of it all. 26 years after Rudolph Valentino's death, his business manager was still chin-deep in hot water as a result of his tenure as the late star's executor. Gene Valentino had just renewed all of his property seizure and wage garnishment orders. Gene's attorney, Morton Filer, explained his client's recent legal action to the press by saying that the interest alone on the judgment against Ullman had reached a tidy sum of $41,000. He then reported that the total amount his client, Gene Valentino, was demanding from Ullman had reached $160,000. The attorney added that over the years, George Ullman faithfully complied with every court order and had kept his client abreast of his financial situation. He also acknowledged it was quite obvious Ullman was, quote, unable to make good on the judgment. When one reporter asked why Gene Valentino would continue to pursue this fruitless collection process, Attorney Filer answered, quote, "Well, who knows? Maybe Ullman will strike it rich someday." There was no doubt it had been a litigious year for Gene Valentino. In October of 1952, he settled out of court on another widely publicized lawsuit, which he filed against independent movie producer Edward Small. Gene objected to nearly every aspect of Small's film titled Valentino by claiming he alone held exclusive publicity rights to Rudolph Valentino. The precise amount the court awarded to Gene was not disclosed, but it was rumored among the press to have been nearly $500,000. While Ed Small was losing his battle in court with Gene Valentino, collector Bill Self began production on a television show for CBS titled The Schlitz Playhouse of Stars. As the show's producer, Self hired many of his Valentino acquaintances, as well as other silent movie stars, including Francis X. Bushman and Doris Kenyon. Gene Valentino was hired as a sound engineer, Rudy's one-time press agent Robert Flory hired as a director, and Rudy's friend Paul Ivanhoe as a cameraman. Rudy's first wife, Jean Acker, was cast as an extra in several episodes, and many of the show's actors were represented by the S. George Ullman Agency. Over the next few years, William Self produced 208 episodes of The Playhouse of Stars for the beer that made Milwaukee famous. and the credits often read like a who's who of Rudolph Valentino's life. Producer Self was acutely aware of the bitter contempt between Gene Valentino and George Ullman, and on and off the set of the Schlitz Playhouse, he continued to play both sides of the contentious dispute, which by then had dragged on for 32 long years. In 1956, Dwight David Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office. Elvis Presley hit the record charts for the first time with Heartbreak Hotel. My Fair Lady opened on Broadway, and Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier of Monaco. That same year, a 63-year-old George Ullman was finally released from any further legal entanglements with Rudolph Valentino's estate. After working his entire career under the threat of Gene's court orders, George was about to retire. On July 17, 1956, Gene accepted a payment from George for $2,500 and agreed to file a satisfaction of judgment with the court. George made this $2,500 payment from funds collected from the sale of his home. With all three of the Ullman children married, George and Bea were moving into an apartment on DeLongpre Avenue in Hollywood. Upon receipt of the $2,500, Gene and his lawyer, Morton Filer, signed the document labeled the Satisfaction of Judgment. Although Gene told William Self that he, quote, never got a thing from George Ullman, George had managed to reimburse the estate for the portion of his executor's salary which was not allowed by the court. He was not able to reimburse Gene for the cash advances he made to Alberto, Maria Strada, and Teresa Warner. After decades of collection processes, Gene was at last legally free to move on and have no further interest in George Ullman. This would not be the case. According to William Self, George, quote, never shared an unkind word with him about Alberto or Gene, while they continued to speak, quote, terribly about him. Self alleged that following the 1956 settlement of the estate, Gene clung to his list of missing items and chided him every June when another item on this list seemed to appear in his collection. For over the years, George continued to arrive with another birthday gift for Self, and each year he told the collector that he would soon have nothing left to give. George parted with Rudy's personal address books, his secretary's address book, and more photographs and legal papers. Although Gene and Alberto were convinced George was financially benefiting from William Self, he was not. In fact, George's family lamented his generosity with Self, as he eventually handed the collector nearly every item he had to give. If this property had been solely of material interest to George, he would have sold it decades earlier for desperately needed cash. Each June 21st, as George shared a birthday cocktail with Self, he had no idea that he was drinking with the enemy, for the collector had long since become a double agent, vowing his primary allegiance to the Valentino family. For when it came to the subject of George Ullman, Self's loyalty to Alberto and Gene Valentino was steadfast and unconditional. While George believed Self was his heartfelt friend, he was unaware that behind his back Self was passing along the Valentinos' disparaging reports about him. Anyone listening to Gene, Alberto, or William Self would readily assume that the Court of Appeals never issued a complete exoneration of George's performance as Rudy's executor. Fueled by a decades-old vendetta against George, Gene signed the final satisfaction of judgment and then launched a retaliatory act of revenge against George Ullman. For even though court records and logic proved otherwise, Gene believed George was solely responsible for the loss of the financial worth of his inheritance. In the wake of the final settlement of the judgment, Gene continued to exact his vengeance, no longer by legal means or by waging a bare-knuckled vendetta against George, but by instigating a vendetta a viva voce, by word of mouth, to their families, Rudy's biographers, the press, and William Self. The name George Ullman became synonymous with nefarious boogeyman upon which all of Jean and Alberto's financial woes, past, present, and future, could be summarily blamed. On the other hand, George said so little about his role as Rudy's executor and his legal involvement with the Valentino estate that his children knew next to nothing about the entire subject. He seldom mentioned the issue in the Ullman household other than an occasional, "that damn Alberto." But Jean and Alberto Valentino were, after all, Rudolph Valentino's kin, and their lineage carried weight in Hollywood. As they imparted their story of the, quote, disreputable and sinister Mr. Ullman, each publication on Valentino strayed farther and farther from the truth. When they were interviewed by biographers, they again reported Rudy left his estate in an equitable three-way split between his brother Alberto, his sister Maria, and Teresa Warner. There was no mention made that George was ordered to reimburse the estate an enormous amount of money that these three people personally spent. No mention was made of any embarrassing weekly stipends, of the fact that Rudy left his siblings no legal share in his estate unless Jean died before reaching the age of 25, and no mention was made of George's complete exoneration on the charges of fraud and mismanagement. In regards to the subject of Rudy's last will and testament, Jean and Alberto made no mention that paragraph 4th ever existed. They divulged nothing about this critical document, which by then, for all intents and purposes, had disappeared from public access for a second time. Meanwhile, George maintained his silence on the entire subject, and his refusal to defend his reputation severely frustrated his family and everyone who knew him. On yet another June 21st, as George rummaged in his garage for a remaining relic for his pal William Self's birthday gift, he made a sickening discovery. His wicker hampers had vanished without a trace, and with them his few effects of his days with Rudy. But George's wicker hampers and paragraph 4th were not the only particulars of Rudy's legacy that were about to turn up missing. Despite Alberto and Jean Valentino's ardent outward appearance that they were protecting Rudy's legacy through frequent litigation, in fact, little about Rudolph Valentino was safe from the pilfering, and no single aspect of his legacy would find safe sanctuary. Jean and Alberto's unshakable vendetta, a vengeful voice from the past, greed, and rampant literary license were about to rewrite Rudolph Valentino's entire story. The real Rudolph Valentino and the real George Ullman were about to be buried deep in a bedrock of wild fabrication. On February 27, 1961, the French magazine La Presse carried an anonymously written article which purported to be Rudolph Valentino's personal diary. The article expanded upon the successful diary format of ex-convict Samuel Roth's pulp fiction work, The Intimate Journal of Rudolph Valentino. Convinced there was more money to be made from the fictionalization of Rudy's sex life, the La Presse article's author expanded upon the theme by transforming Samuel Roth's heterosexual Rudy into a homosexual Rudy. The La Presse author wrote Rudy into a string of exclusively homosexual scenarios. Despite the anonymous author's claims that Rudy and a male lover, quote, made love like tigers, the alleged personal diary was never authenticated. It was difficult for anyone to believe the journal had any credibility, as the inaccurate dates, locations, and specifics of all of the events read as muddled fiction. A French biographer of Valentino, Jean de Recville, issued a public challenge to the author of the La Presse article, requesting that a single line of this alleged diary be publicly reproduced for handwriting authentication. In her Valentino biography, de Recville published an authenticated letter in Rudy's handwriting to allow for an easy comparison. The La Presse article's author never came forward and never produced a single line of the diary. Despite the La Presse article's lack of historical accuracy and the author's steadfast anonymity, the article's episodes were accepted as fact and soon quoted and referenced in future publications on Rudolph Valentino. 5 years after the publication of the La Presse article, a man named Chaw Mank would make a name for himself by writing undocumented fan fiction about Rudy. During the 1920s, Chaw Mank lived in Hollywood, where he founded some 50 unofficial fan clubs while working as publisher and sole employee of his movie fan newsletter. Mank boasted he mailed 25,000 letters a year to movie stars, including Rudolph Valentino, in which he requested memorabilia and answers to his questionnaires. Regarding his correspondence with Valentino, Mank would claim the star divulged confidential secrets of a graphically sexual nature to him. In light of Mank's ability to relate anything a star shared with his fan clubs via his newsletter, it is unlikely any of the movie stars did so. Nevertheless, Mank asserted Rudolph Valentino did just that. After Mank left Hollywood, he retired to Southern Illinois in a modest suburban home where he worked amidst towering stacks of papers. He accumulated his tumbling archives not only from years of organizing fan clubs, but from composing country western songs. During his career, Chaw Mank scored one country western hit titled "I Don't Want a Bracelet of Diamonds, I Just Want Elvis," and one hit book, The Intimate and Shocking Expose of Rudolph Valentino. In 1965, Mank collaborated on The Intimate and Shocking Expose of Rudolph Valentino with self-proclaimed authority on unidentified flying objects and alien abductions, Brad Steiger. Although Brad Steiger authored books titled The Flying Saucer Menace and Flying Saucer Invasion Target Earth, and asserted aliens attended his lectures disguised as human beings, his interest in writing about Rudolph Valentino was based upon one more down-to-earth fact. He believed his father-in-law was Valentino's illegitimate son. The cover of Mank and Steiger's sensational novel screamed, "The Shocking Expose of the Fiery Love God Rudolph Valentino." The subtitle read, "Was he chic or sham?" Mank and Steiger portrayed Rudy as a confused homosexual who lived his life as a promiscuous frequenter of gay bathhouses in Hollywood, where he only, quote, resorted to homosexuality after failing to satisfy women. They elaborated upon one of his, quote, humiliating failures by portraying Rudy shedding tears of embarrassment and, quote, spraying vomit in disgust, while his frustrated female sexual partner referred to him as a, quote, goddamn queer. It was because of scenes such as these, claimed Mank and Steiger, that Rudy was motivated into becoming gay. They expounded at length upon Rudy's, quote, silly interviews before his death, and implied his interest in the sport of boxing at this time in his life was only feigned as a, quote, pathetic attempt to prove his manlyhood. They claimed Rudy was so emotionally weak that he trembled in fear in Natasha Rumbova's presence, and that the Valentino's marriage was loveless, platonic, and arranged. Since Chaw Mank did have a correspondence with Rudy decades earlier, as he had with 50 other movie stars, he and Steiger had some authentic material to exploit. But Rudolph Valentino could never have imagined that Chaw Mank would later splice his gracious comments, forwarded for use in the movie fans' newsletter, into an X-rated and homophobic narrative, as if to imply he was personally commenting upon the text. In the foreword of their book, Steiger and Mank wrote, quote, "One never knows when a harmless bit of exaggeration may someday require the substantiation of an outright lie," end quote. When Brad Steiger was asked to substantiate some of these, quote, exaggerations, he claimed the book was based solely on Mank's own memories, as, quote, he did have extensive contacts among the Hollywood gay community at the time. Despite this, in their shocking expose, Mank and Steiger refer to homosexuals attending a tribute to Rudy as being, quote, deviates. Their book is littered with references to Rudy's, quote, ludicrous love life and his, quote, unresolved sexuality, and is so sexual in content that in many libraries it is not cataloged under biography, but under the heading Human Sexuality. Mencken Steiger's book enjoyed tremendous play, was made into a movie, and became a prime reference source for further biographies published in subsequent years. Other authors expanded upon Menk's book by claiming Valentino had sexual relationships with nearly every man he met. These books also demonstrated a lack of solid documentation for any of these reports, as these books were most often presented by their authors as nonfiction. Readers began believing that perhaps they were true. Despite this, every member of Rudy's family and his personal acquaintances were frustrated with the inaccurate books. They protested the efforts of the literary opportunists, who were creating an increasingly popular assertion that Rudy led his brief life as a closeted gay man. They lived their lives in his daily presence, knew him intimately, and adamantly claimed this was not Rudy's truth. Paul Ivanhoe and Gene Acker criticized everything, from the outrageously fictional books to the anonymous articles, and even the annual reveling at Rudy's mausoleum on the day of his death. Nevertheless, the smut and soft porn about Rudy issued by Steiger, Menck, and other authors continued to generate enough prurient interest to sell books and turn a profit. Rudy's sexual orientation was not the only aspect of his life undergoing major reconstruction. By the end of the 1960s, both he and George Ullman could scarcely have undergone more thorough makeovers if they'd enrolled in a witness protection plan. And with the sexploitation of Rudolph Valentino moving into high gear, Gene and Alberto's defamatory version of George's performance as the executor of Rudy's estate was about to receive a mighty assist from none other than Luther H. Mahoney. While Gene Valentino had been pursuing his collection processes on George, Lou worked as a mechanic for the Lockheed Martin Corporation in Burbank, California. He slipped into relative obscurity after his appearance in the courtroom in 1930, and did not receive the slightest mention in any books written about Rudolph Valentino, even those published by George Ullman and Natasha Rambova. In 1973, an article would change all of this. It was then writer Raymond Lee published an article based on his interview with Lou regarding his employment with Rudolph Valentino. Lou seized that opportunity to grab the spotlight once again, and handed Raymond Lee his own version of the tale, one that would warm the hearts of Gene and Alberto Valentino. Lou taped a few hours of rambling thoughts, and it was from the content of these tapes that Lee wrote his article, The Legend of Valentino, for Movie Classics magazine. In his article, Raymond Lee made no reference to nearly half of Mahoney's lengthy reminiscence, which was nothing more than a furious tirade directed at George Ullman. Lou's trenchant animosity towards George apparently festered during his years on the Lockheed assembly line in Burbank. For when he sat down with writer Raymond Lee to record his memories of working on Valentino's cars, feeding the falcons, and digging the ditches at Falcon Lair, he did little else but roast George Ullman. Although many of Lou's recollections were foggy inaccuracies, he exhibited superhuman powers of memory while relating certain conversations verbatim, which he claimed took place 40 years earlier. These selected conversations cast him in the role of power broker, peacemaker, and fatherly confidant to his employers, Mr. and Mrs. Valentino. He made no mention of the settlement of the estate or of his role in the court proceedings. He also blamed Mr. Ullman for everything from the Valentino's divorce to Natasha's exclusion from Rudy's United Artists contract, and for outright embezzling every cent of Rudy's fortune. He also erroneously took full credit for negotiating a loan for Rudy from the Cinema Finance Company, and timed this loan a full year before its actual transaction. Lou's fractured fairy tale of life in the Valentino household, where he, as the venerable handyman, appeared to hold the seat of power at the head of the dinner table, became more of the questionable, undocumented fabrication that was soon believed to be fact. For even though Raymond Lee chose to omit Lou Mahoney's screed about George Ullman in his article, Lou's taped reminiscences were soon in circulation, and future publications on Valentino were taking a fresh look at the handyman's role in the movie star's life. With Lou Mahoney bolstering Gene and Alberto Valentino's 30-year vilification of George Ullman, the truth about Rudy's manager faded not so slowly from the public domain. And as George continued to say nothing, the resulting new version of the story became a patchwork artifice of inaccuracies, with Lou Mahoney the hero, George Ullman a thug, and Rudolph Valentino a gay icon. No, of course not. I was not even married yet. This was Alberto Valentino's reply to a question posed by a reporter from the Italian-American newspaper L'Italo Americano. The reporter sensed he'd hit a nerve after commenting upon how Alberto's son Gene physically resembled his famous uncle Rudolph. "When did Rudolph know your son?" the reporter continued to pry. "When he left Italy, naturally, your son had not been born yet." Alberto reiterated his point by saying he was still a single man when his brother left Italy in December of 1913. He then abruptly changed the subject by informing the reporter how lawyers were making off with the little money that remained of his brother's estate. He went on to explain that he recently retired from his position as an accountant with 20th Century Fox. To the reporter's surprise, he then proceeded to divulge the shocking news that his brother Rudolph once filed a petition to legally adopt Gene. The reporter had to wonder, why would Rudolph Valentino attempt to adopt his brother's son? At the time Alberto made this startling revelation to L'Italo Americano, Gene Valentino was living in Los Angeles, working as a television sound technician and operating a stereo installation business. Among his famous clientele were Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, and Danny Kaye. Gene was busy filing several more lawsuits over the years, including a suit against the Disney Corporation after their showing a clip of the Son of the Sheik without his permission. Another lawsuit was filed against Spelling and Goldberg Productions, protesting their television production, The Legend of Valentino, a romantic fiction. In the latter case, the judge ruled that the, quote, right to exploit Rudolph Valentino was not exclusively Gene Valentino's, end quote. Gene not only owed some of his success as a Hollywood sound engineer to his famous last name, but also to William Self. As an influential television producer, Self granted Gene steady work in a string of successful television shows in the early 1960s. By then, Self had become a wealthy man and lived in a Bel Air hilltop home a stone's throw from Falcon Lair. It was just at that last bend in the road, where visitors to his residence could climb no higher above the City of Angels, that Self called home. On the right side of his elegant home's foyer, a spiral staircase swept up to a second-floor landing. About halfway up the staircase, anyone of moderate height could spot the toes of a pair of polished black riding boots, jutting out eye level through the landing's wrought iron railing. Rudy's riding boots were positioned as gatekeepers to Self's inner sanctum, his Valentino collection. These very boots were once inverted in the stirrups of Rudy's favorite horse, Firefly, during the memorial service held in his honor by the Hollywood Breakfast Club. Decades later, these infamous boots sat frozen in time on William Self's landing, where they collected dust along with several glass curio cabinets chocked full of Rudy's ruins, his personal shaving case with the letters RGV embossed on the leather cover, a circular leather box of shirt collars imprinted by Rudy's laundry, a cigarette holder used as a prop in The Sheik, a heavy crescent dagger worn by Rudy in The Son of the Sheik, and random photographs and movie stills which were strewn about. Hanging on the walls of this narrow landing were framed photographs of Self with his Valentino friends, including one snapshot of Gene Valentino resembling Rudy if he had lived to be 60 years old. Well, yes, Self proudly said. He looked exactly like him. In an anteroom adjoining this landing were boxes of more of Rudy's archives, the detective agency's reports of Natasha's affair, Rudy and Natasha's love letters, and Rudy's clothes, still draped on their hangers. Rudy shared his niche in William Self's home with other valuable collections: shelves of leather-bound first edition books, various gifts from Self's famous friends in show business, including Fred Astaire, Spencer Tracy, and Katharine Hepburn, and choice memorabilia once owned by the author of The Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum. Self displayed L. Frank Baum's sundial on the wall of his den. His fascination with the historian of Oz was understandable, for when it came to the subject of collecting memorabilia, Self was a bona fide wizard. Whether Jean, Alberto, and George visited Self over the years for his assurances their Rudy treasures were safe for posterity, or whether they courted him to secure work in one of his television shows, they had all paid close attention to the man behind the curtain. It was inevitable Self would eventually acquire competition as he collected Rudy's earthly baggage, and one particular collector in the Chicago suburb of Evanston, Illinois, gave Self a serious run for his position as Valentino collector non pari. But to Self's dismay, the Evanston collector revered Chaw Mank and was an outspoken and leading proponent of the belief that Rudy led his life as a closeted homosexual. His conviction that Rudolph Valentino led a secret sex life extended well beyond his collection of artifacts and to the purchase of a crypt near Rudy's in Hollywood, where he planned to cozy up to his favorite screen icon during his afterlife. Any attempts by William Self and those who knew Rudy personally to convince the Evanston collector his assessment was incorrect went unheeded. Despite whispered warnings about the Evanston collector's alleged underhanded business practices, few dared to confront his self-proclaimed authority on the subject of Rudolph Valentino. No one stepped forward to dispute his assertion that Rudy had an army of secret gay lovers. Anyone daring to protest, whether in person or online, were called bigots and homophobes and promptly rebuffed. The Evanston collector soon found devoted kindred spirits, as his purporting that Valentino is gay gained popularity. Accepting the contents of the two undocumented books on this subject as fact, he and his followers expounded upon the fan-fictional accounts at the annual crypt ceremony at Rudy's gravesite. As an influential owner of Rudy memorabilia, the Evanston collector often delivered the keynote address at this highly publicized mausoleum tribute to Rudy. There, he and his cadre promoted their various books on Rudy's alleged secret life, forged their alliances, and transacted the business of pricing and selling their Rudy wares. Meanwhile, William Self grew suspicious, even fearful of his competition, and wholeheartedly disagreed with the Evanston collector's fundamentalist conviction that Rudy had a secret gay life. After Self witnessed the collector's ruthless campaigns to destroy the reputations of several fellow collectors, he assumed a wary stance and gave the collector a chilly shoulder. However, where Self was concerned, business was still business, and with more deals to be negotiated, many of his Rudy holdings were soon whipping back and forth between his Bel Air mansion and Evanston, Illinois. It seems some of those personal treasures that Alberto, Jean, and George dedicated to Self for his safekeeping were slipping right out his back door. On the 50th anniversary of Rudolph Valentino's death, William Self organized a showing of Rudy's film The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse with the Screen Actors Guild and CBS Television at the Academy of Arts and Sciences on Wilshire Boulevard. It was after this gala event that Alberto and Jean Valentino presented Self with a special gift, Rudy's favorite platinum wristwatch. Self was thrilled with his latest bauble, for even after his decades of serious collecting, there were pieces of Rudy he still coveted. He lamented Rudy's toupee had slipped by him, and hoped one day he might get his hands on any photographs of Rudy's body as it was being embalmed. George's resolute silence regarding his legal travails with Alberto and Jean eventually inspired his curious adult children to seek the truth regarding their father's affiliation with the settlement of Rudolph Valentino's estate. Decades after the fact, they believed that reading the actual court documentation of their father's tenure as executor would be the logical place to launch their investigation. By reading the publicly archived court records, anyone would be able to review the facts of the settlement of the estate, the details of George's performance as executor, and the text of Rudy's will. All of this documentation would, by law, be held for public access in the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. The Ullman children dispatched a private investigator on their behalf to recover this documentation. After a lengthy search, only a few documents in the case number 83678, Rudolph Valentino, were recovered. These records were only notices of Gene Valentino's collection processes on George and were all dated well after 1939. Some 13 years of Rudolph Valentino's estate records appeared to be mysteriously missing from the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. The Ullman's private investigator then conducted an exasperating year-long search for Rudy's missing records. This case file would, by law, contain all of the court's records from the settlement of his estate and span a time frame from Rudy's death in 1926 to those few existing records still on file in the Hall of Records dating after 1939. When the Hall of Records was alerted to their missing case file, they completed their own internal search. They then forwarded a notarized letter to the Ullmans, issued by the executive officer of the Superior Court of Los Angeles, which was labeled as Certificate of Clerk. It read that in regards to Rudolph Valentino's pre-1939 records, quote, the subject case was not readily available for inspection by the public due to the case file being missing, end quote. The law in Los Angeles County clearly states that all requests for access to documents archived in the County Hall of Records be accompanied by the completion of a small form. Printed across the top of this form in bold letters are the words, "Warning, read this, you could go to prison." The form's fine print explains how the removal of a single sheet of documentation represents the theft of government property and thereby constitutes a felony in the eyes of the law. When not a scrap of documentation prior to 1939 could be found in the Hall of Records, it became apparent this threat of imprisonment was no deterrent for some brazen thief or thieves who made off with the entire case file of Rudy's public records. The Ullman's private investigator persevered in the search for any existing copies of Rudy's missing documents. It was at this point William Self was questioned about his knowledge of Rudy's purloined case file. Self made a stunning admission when he acknowledged cagily that at one time he'd actually had all of those, quote, stolen records in his personal possession. With no hesitation, he proceeded to point his finger east and incriminate his troublesome adversary, the Evanston collector. It was he, Self alleged, who currently had possession of the entire file of Rudy's stolen records. Self added that the collector would never admit to having the documents in his possession and proceeded to divulge how the Evanston collector once loaned him the file for his perusal. Quote, I read them and then shipped them directly back to him, end quote, Self swore. As he reiterated that anyone citing the documents of the stolen records would be incriminating themselves as having had them in their possession, Self proceeded to do just that. He recalled how he read that Gene and Alberto once accused George Ullman in court of spending estate money on baby food, pork chops, and even peanut butter. Self was quick to point out he only read the stolen file of documents before promptly returning them all to their unrightful owner in Evanston, Illinois. Self then agreed to telephone the collector to see whether he would allow the ill-gotten public documents to be read one more time. Perhaps Self believed confession to be good for the soul, for he then blurted out to the Ullman's investigator one more unsolicited tidbit of information. He said that he, quote, didn't know what happened to those cartons that were stolen from George Ullman's garage, end quote, some 30 years earlier. It was not long after this cryptic admission that Self relayed a message to the investigator via email from the Evanston collector. Self said the collector denied any access to the stolen case file and reported he had just that very week shipped all of the Hall of Records missing stolen documents to the spokeswoman for the Valentino family, Jean Valentino's granddaughter, by saying, quote, "Unfortunately, the Valentino collector who has all the legal records regarding the dispute between the Valentino family and George Ullman has decided to turn them all over to the Valentino family, and this is where they belong," he added. Self closed his email by saying that since Jean Valentino's granddaughter was working on a book herself, he, quote, "doubted that she would share them with anyone," end quote. The Evanston collector neglected to pass along the news to William Self that in exchange for handing the stolen file over to the Valentino family, he accepted one of Rudy's dress shirts as compensation. This was distressing news for George Ullman's children, as they realized the very documents they had been searching for had been in the possession of the Evanston collector, a man whose platform they disagreed with wholeheartedly. For the collector not only purported that nearly every male Rudy ever encountered was one of his secret gay lovers, he also claimed their father, George Ullman, was also Rudy's gay lover. The Ullmans' disappointment was further compounded when they realized the Evanston collector had just returned the stolen court records to the very people who were still nursing a decades-old and bitter vendetta against their father. The next logical step for their private investigator was to schedule an interview with Jean Valentino's granddaughter. This request was denied due to what she referred to in her written response as the, quote, "personal nature of our documentation." Fortunately for the Ullman children, at this juncture, they were no further frustrating dead ends in their search for the truth about their father's role in the settlement of Rudolph Valentino's estate. For their investigator had just uncovered a duplicate set of Rudy's missing records. Unknown to the Evanston collector, William Self, and the Valentino family, when George filed his appeal of the judgment against him in 1932, most of those very court records were copied and filed with the Court of Appeals Library in San Francisco. This enormous case file of over 1,000 pages included not only the Court of Appeals decision, but a wealth of other supporting documentation, including transcripts of court testimony, details of Rudy's business holdings and transactions, documented proof of George's performance as Rudy's executor, Falcon Lair's household records and payroll accounts, and the court-ordered Baskerville audit schedules. After months of anticipation, George Ullman's children finally sat down to read. They found that the court records contained some startling revelations. Contrary to the commonly held version of the story, as related in every book and article published about Rudolph Valentino to date, they discovered Jean was Rudy's sole heir, and that the Valentino estate was never divided in a three-way split between Alberto, his sister Maria, and Natasha's Aunt Teresa Warner. As the Ullman family read through the records, they discovered a copy of the elusive paragraph 4th tucked within the stack of documents before them. They had read the widely publicized single page of Rudy's will, but knew nothing of this second page's existence. After disappearing for decades, paragraph 4th surfaced once again to prove Rudy named Jean his sole heir and left his brother nothing more than an inheritance of a weekly allowance, which terminated the moment Jean turned 25. And contrary to Alberto and Jean Valentino's version of events, the court records definitively proved George Ullman was exonerated on all charges of fraud and mismanagement, and a court-ordered audit found his executor ledgers to be in perfect order. The Ullmans also learned Alberto and Jean Valentino's pursuit of the judgment against their father was not to collect money he had allegedly embezzled from the estate, but an attempt to force him to reimburse them for the very money they spent decades earlier. The court records revealed other information directly at odds with Alberto and Jean's public accounts. Over the years, Alberto claimed he was still a single man with no children when his younger brother Rudolph left Italy in December of 1913. According to court records, he was married on December 19, 1912, 1 year earlier. Upon further analysis of the court documents, a possible reason why Alberto may have been confused about this critical date came to light. A simple mathematical calculation and a wealth of accompanying circumstantial evidence created a compelling possible scenario. Jean Valentino was born on August 14, 1914 in Santero Moncole, a small town located a few miles north of Rudy's last home in Taranto, Italy. Jean's birth took place nearly 2 years after Alberto's marriage and just less than 8 months after Rudy's confrontation with his outraged family members and subsequent hasty departure for America. What could have prompted Alberto to swear publicly that he did not marry until well after his brother left Italy? If this were the case, then this would have been tacit admission that his son was conceived out of wedlock. Perhaps Rudy was not the only Guglielmi brother whose life was forever changed during that infamous and contentious family meeting. Had both Alberto and Rudy dutifully obeyed the mandate of the family elders issued on that fateful day? Had the Guglielmi family's solution to a lamentable but common predicament resulted in a lifetime of resentment and anger between the two brothers? Were the court records stolen from the Hall of Records and the story purposely skewed over the years by the Valentino family to prevent the public from ever discovering a dark family secret? Had the older, employed, married, yet still childless Alberto been informed that he would save the family's face by signing the birth certificate of his teenage brother Rudolph's love child? Was Alberto told that he and his wife would raise this child, conceived sometime during the end of October and the 1st of November in 1913, as their own son? Were Rudy's regular cash payments made to Alberto over the years sent as child support? And during the final months of Rudy's life, did he attempt to gain legal custody of his only son as his sole heir? Did Jean consequently spend his life attempting to reclaim in any way possible his true heritage, which he was denied at birth? And by mere happenstance, had George Ullman simply stepped into the line of fire and become an unsuspecting target for a family willing to go to any lengths to prevent the answers to these and more questions from ever being known? George's children wondered, could their father's silence over the years and his refusal to ever publicly criticize Jean Valentino in word or in print be explained by his own knowledge of this well-kept secret and his respect for Rudy's profound love for the son he had been forced to surrender as a teenager? The daring and effective heist of all of Rudy's public records preceding the date Jean inherited the estate in 1939 ensured that the only documents filed under Rudolph Valentino's name in the L.A. County Hall of Records pertained solely to the collection processes on the judgment held against George Ullman. Consequently, by absconding with not only critical pieces of the puzzle, but the entire puzzle, none of this documentation, including the contents of paragraph 4th, could ever be referenced by the public. For George Ullman's family, this unfortunate situation meant that any evidence that might have vindicated his tarnished reputation as Rudy's executor was also unavailable to the public for decades. The even more shocking revelation was the realization that for many years the Valentino family, the Evanston collector, and William's self all had possession of and access to the entire body of missing court records. Despite having full knowledge of the contents of these remarkable documents, they'd all conspired to suppress the facts about George Ullman's role as executor, the terms of Rudy's will, and the circumstances of Jean's inheritance. In the wake of William Self's request that the Evanston collector allow the stolen records to be read one more time, the collector severed all ties with Self. The two collectors would share no more cordial luncheons in Hollywood and conduct no further business dealings. Nevertheless, the Evanston collector and his fellow Valentino collectors continued to collaborate and produce shinier Valentino documentaries, convene in Hollywood on the anniversary of Valentino's tragic death, purchase more Valentino memorabilia, and publish their own books on their favorite subject. Over time, they closed ranks as they enforced a fanatical and ruthless control over the legacy of Rudolph Valentino and their valuable collections. Fierce alliances were formed, and for decades they have portrayed their false and undocumented version of both Valentino's and George Allman's lives as gospel truth. Anyone challenging their status quo is promptly cut from the herd by means of a range of well-known, underhanded tactics, including online defamation, harassment, and even litigation. During the initial days of the Allman's private investigators' search for Rudy's court records, a collector of celebrity archives was contacted. This collector's professional reputation was founded upon his expert ability to conduct extensive searches for celebrity documents within the LA County Hall of Records. He offered the following commentary upon the subject of Rudolph Valentino's missing records. Quote, "We have requested dozens of various obscure yet high-profile probate cases that can date back nearly 100 years, and the only two that never surfaced were Valentino's and that of L. Frank Baum, the author of the Wizard of Oz books." End quote. Under a freeway overpass on the seamier side of Los Angeles, a bronze and copper casket was hauled out of a mortuary warehouse for the first time in 77 years. Like a great vessel run aground, the metal case was so cumbersome it took the efforts of 3 brawny workers to heft the unwieldy bark onto a mortuary gurney. It was oppressively hot that summer morning, and no day to be working up such a sweat. But the men had their orders. They were to have the neglected relic on display in one of the mortuary's private chapels by 9 o'clock sharp. Just before the hour, they wheeled the casket into the small sanctuary, lifted off the heavy cover, and propped it against the wall. It was the responsibility of the floor mortician to oversee the arrangement in each of the mortuary's chapels, and it was during his inspection he noticed what appeared to be an inscription on the casket's tarnished lid. He returned to his office, where he rummaged about for a rag and a can of brass polish to wipe away the years of neglect. Returning to the chapel, he marveled at the case's extraordinary condition and its masterful construction. He knew that during the 1920s, this type of case was actually a sarcophagus, a shipping case which was legally required whenever a coffin was transported across state lines. The mortician continued his buffing, ran his hands over the delicate beads of solder, and tried to remove a few scratch marks still evident from the transport of the interior coffin. When he'd restored the copper to a brilliant shine, he read the inscription, "Rudolph Guglielmi, Rudolph Valentino, born May 6, 1895, died August 23, 1926. It was then he realized the significance of this sarcophagus. In this case, Rudolph Valentino's lifeless body had jostled along the rails on its long and final road home to California. Just as his last film, The Son of the Sheik, was opening in theaters across the country, this very case was being shoved aside in a warehouse where it would sit in the shadows for the next 77 years. When news reached William Self that Rudolph Valentino's sarcophagus had just been discovered in the dark recesses of a Los Angeles mortuary, the race was on. He swooped down from his Bel Air eyrie to open negotiations with assorted morticians and shady middlemen. In hushed voices of funereal condolence, they got right down to business and began crunching the numbers for their deal of a lifetime. The cross and double-crossing soon had the bidding soaring into the tens of thousands of dollars, as any last regard for the sanctity of Rudolph Valentino's final resting place twisted like chaff in the dry Santa Ana winds. Hovering over the great sarcophagus, the men scrutinized every detail of their prize and pondered that one gaping detail missing from the scenario: the corpse. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 15, titled The Son of the Sheik Says Goodbye. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find a copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.